The laughter started before I even left the throne room. I stood in the center of the Hall of Lineages, beneath the vaulted ceiling where the names of every fertile daughter in our dynasty had been carved in glowing script for 11,000 years. My name was not among them. It had never been, and every soul in that chamber knew it. 200 members of the withHFY High Court sat in their tiered seats, draped in ceremonial silks that shifted color with their moods. Right now, almost every garment in the room flickered between pale gold and deep violet. Amusement and contempt. They were not even trying to hide it. My sister withHFY stood at the sovereign's right hand, her posture perfect, her silk burning a steady, regal crimson. She was reading from a formal scroll, and her voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who had rehearsed cruelty until it sounded like kindness. In recognition of the newly established diplomatic channel with the species known as humans, she said, and in the spirit of cultural partnership, the sovereignty shall send a representative of royal blood to serve as cultural liaison to Earth. This appointment shall be held by Princess Viara of the fourth seat. Fourth seat, the lowest rank a royal daughter could hold. The rank they gave to those who would never produce heirs, never bond, never matter. She could have simply said my name, but she wanted the court to hear the number. A ripple of sound passed through the chamber, not gasps, not whispers, something worse, the soft, controlled exhale of 200 people, suppressing laughter at the same moment. I felt it land on my skin like venom. I looked at my father. The sovereign sat motionless on the amber throne, his ceremonial crest fully extended, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that did not include me. He had been informed of this decision. He had approved it, and now he would not look at me while it was carried out. I understood everything in that moment, with a clarity that felt like a blade pressed against my throat. This was not a diplomatic appointment. This was disposal. The withHFY did not send princesses to primitive species for cultural exchange. We sent resources we no longer valued, broken tools, expired medicine, and now, a barren daughter whose very existence reminded the court that even royal blood could produce something worthless. Humans. I knew almost nothing about them. They had been admitted to the galactic fringe less than 3 standard cycles ago, a noisy little species from a death-class planet, notable only for their stubbornness and their unsettling habit of forming emotional attachments to everything they encountered. Other species kept them at arm's length. The withHFY had barely acknowledged their existence. And now I was being sent to live among them, wrapped in the thin fiction of diplomacy, because my sister had found the most elegant way to make me disappear. withHFY finished reading and looked at me. Her silk shifted to a warm, sisterly blue. Her eyes did not match it. "The sovereignty thanks you for your service, Viara," she said. I bowed, not because I wanted to, because 200 people were watching, and I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I held the bow for exactly the required duration, straightened, and walked out of the Hall of Lineages without looking back. The corridors outside were empty. My footsteps echoed against the polished stone, and with each step, the reality of what had just happened settled deeper into my chest, like a stone sinking through dark water. I was being exiled, formally, legally, and permanently. The scroll had not specified a return date. No one had mentioned a timeline for review. I was being sent to the far edge of known space, to live among a species the galaxy considered barely civilized, and I was expected to stay there until everyone forgot I existed. Dorath was waiting in my chambers. She was older than me by 40 cycles, her crest thinned with age, her silk a steady, loyal gray that never shifted. She had served my mother before she died, and she had chosen to stay with me afterward, even when every other attendant in the palace found reasons to transfer to more promising households. When I walked in, she took one look at my face and began packing. "I am coming with you," she said, before I could speak. "Dorath, you do not have to do this." "I know I do not have to. That is why it matters that I choose to." She folded a garment with precise, angry movements. "Humans. They are sending you to humans, as if you were surplus grain." I sat on the edge of my sleeping platform and watched her pack. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had been expecting this for a long time. Perhaps she had. Perhaps everyone had seen this coming except me, because I had been foolish enough to believe that my family would at least allow me to remain in the shadows of my own world, rather than casting me into the shadows of someone else's. The shuttle they gave me was small, not a royal transport with its escort fleet and diplomatic markings, but a standard-class diplomatic courier vessel, the kind used for delivering documents and low-priority cargo. It had 2 sleeping compartments, a basic nutrition synthesizer, and navigation systems that were a generation out of date. The message was clear even in the choice of vehicle. I was low-priority cargo. We launched from the orbital platform without ceremony. No one came to see us off. No formal departure rites, no blessing from the sovereign, no court witnesses to mark the occasion. Just 2 withHFY women in a small ship, sliding away from the planet I had called home for my entire life, heading toward a world I had never seen, to live among creatures I did not understand. The journey took 11 days in compressed space. 11 days in a ship that hummed with a slightly irregular engine frequency that made my teeth ache. 11 days of Dorath cooking meals in the tiny galley, and pretending everything was normal. 11 days of me sitting in the observation pod, watching the stars blur past, and trying to decide whether I felt more angry or more afraid. I pulled up everything our databases had on humans during the transit. It was not much, a species barely 300,000 years old, which was practically infantile by galactic standards. Carbon-based, oxygen-breathing, warm-blooded, they reproduced slowly and died quickly, rarely lasting more than a single century. Their planet was classified as a Category 7 death world, riddled with tectonic instability, predatory megafauna, extreme weather systems, and a rotational axial tilt that subjected them to wildly shifting seasonal climates. By all reasonable metrics, they should have gone extinct several times over. They had not. No one could adequately explain why. I found a single image of a human in the diplomatic files. A male, standing in front of some kind of governmental building. He looked shockingly plain. No cranial crest, no bioluminescent markings, no venom ridges, no defensive plating. Just soft skin stretched over a bipedal frame, with dark eyes that stared directly into the recording lens, with an expression I could not read. He looked fragile. He looked like something that should not have survived its own world, let alone reach the stars. I closed the file and stared at the wall of my sleeping compartment for a long time. On the 11th day, we dropped out of compressed space at the edge of a yellow star system, and the ship's sensors immediately began screaming. Not danger alerts, communication intercepts. The space around this planet was saturated with signals. Radio transmissions, data bursts, entertainment broadcasts, navigation beacons, satellite chatter, and something my system could not categorize that turned out to be music. Thousands of channels of music, pouring out of the planet in every direction, filling the void with organized noise. Dorath came to the observation pod and stood beside me as Earth filled the viewport. It was blue and white and green, swirling with weather systems, glittering with city lights on its dark side. It looked chaotic. It looked alive, in a way that withHFY Prime, with its ordered continents and climate-controlled atmosphere, never had. "It sounds like madness," Dorath said, listening to the cacophony of intercepted signals. She was right. It did sound like madness. Millions of voices talking over each other, singing over each other, arguing and laughing and broadcasting into the void, as if they were absolutely certain someone was listening. No discipline, no structure, no silence. I pressed my hand against the viewport glass and felt the cold of space on the other side. Somewhere down there, on that loud, chaotic, impossibly alive planet, my exile was waiting for me, and I did not know yet whether the noise I was hearing was the sound of a world gone mad, or the sound of a world that had simply never learned to stop fighting for every single breath. I would find out soon enough. The landing was rougher than I expected. Earth's atmosphere was thick, heavy with moisture and nitrogen, and our shuttle shuddered through layers of turbulence that would not have existed on a properly managed planet. Dorath gripped her restraints and muttered prayers to ancestors I was fairly certain had stopped listening to either of us. I kept my hands flat on my knees and focused on breathing. We touched down at a facility that my navigation system identified as a United Nations diplomatic intake center, located in a region called Geneva. I had expected something grand, The Kirethi diplomatic quarter on our homeworld was a sprawling complex of crystal towers and reflection pools, designed to communicate power before a single word was spoken. This place was a cluster of rectangular buildings made of glass and pale stone, surrounded by green vegetation and a perimeter fence that looked like it was meant to keep animals out rather than dignitaries in. The air hit me when the shuttle doors opened. It was warm, dense, and carried 1,000 smells I could not identify. Earth's gravity was 11% heavier than Kirethi standard, and I felt it immediately in my knees and lower back. Every step down the boarding ramp required a tiny recalculation of balance, as if the planet itself was testing me. A small group of humans waited on the landing pad. 5 of them, dressed in matching dark clothing that I later learned was called formal attire. They were shorter than I expected. Most Kirethi stood nearly 2 meters tall, and these humans averaged perhaps 20 centimeters less. But they stood with a peculiar straightness, a groundedness, as if the heavy gravity that pulled at me was something they had been wrestling their entire lives and had long since beaten into submission. One of them stepped forward. He was tall for a human, with dark brown skin and close-cropped black hair, and he moved with an unhurried calm that I recognized instinctively. I had spent my life in courts. I knew what controlled composure looked like. This man had it. But his version was different from the Kirethi model. Kirethi composure was about concealing. His seemed to be about choosing what to reveal. "Princess Viara," he said, and his pronunciation of my name was surprisingly accurate. "Welcome to Earth. My name is Callum Mercer. I will be your diplomatic liaison and primary point of contact during your stay." I gave him the formal Kirethi greeting, pressing 2 fingers to my throat in acknowledgement. He watched the gesture carefully, then mimicked it with his own hand. It was imperfect but earnest, and I did not know what to do with earnestness. It was not a currency that held value in the Kirethi court. "Thank you, Liaison Mercer," I said, keeping my voice flat and formal. "I trust arrangements have been made." "They have. We have prepared quarters for you and your companion, and there is no schedule for today. I thought you might want to rest after the journey, before we discuss anything official." I stared at him. No schedule, no immediate debriefing, no protocol session, no formal introduction to a chain of command. He was offering me rest, as if my comfort was a factor that mattered. "That is acceptable," I said, because I did not know what else to say. He walked us to our quarters personally, pointing out buildings and pathways as we went. The dining facility, the medical wing, a green space he called the garden, which appeared to be a curated section of controlled plant growth, though far wilder and less geometric than any Kirethi garden I had seen. He spoke about each location, as if he were showing a new neighbor around a residential area, not briefing a foreign dignitary on a diplomatic compound. The quarters were modest but clean. 2 connected rooms with sleeping platforms that were too soft, a bathing facility with water-based systems instead of sonic cleaners, and a common area with seating and a large window that looked out over the garden. On the table in the common area, someone had placed a vase of cut flowers. I stared at them for a long time after Callum left. On Kirethi Prime, cutting a living plant and placing it indoors for decorative purposes would be considered bizarre. Here, apparently, it was a gesture of welcome. They had killed a piece of their world and arranged it beautifully, just to make a stranger feel at home. I did not rest. I stood at the window and watched the compound below. Humans moved through the spaces with a casual energy that I found disorienting. They walked in pairs and small groups, talking with their hands, touching each other on shoulders and arms with an ease that would have been scandalous in Kirethi society. A child ran across the garden path, and 3 adults I could see were unrelated to it stopped what they were doing to watch it, ready to intervene if it fell. It did not fall. It ran in a wide, joyful circle, and one of the adults laughed. I turned away from the window because something about that laughter made my chest hurt, and I did not want to examine why. The first days blurred together in a haze of adjustment and quiet misery. Callum appeared each morning with what he called a schedule suggestion, which was never a demand, always an invitation. Meetings with low-level human cultural officials who asked earnest questions about Kirethi society. Tours of facilities I did not care about. Meals where human staff attempted to serve synthesized versions of Kirethi nutrition that tasted almost right, but never quite. I performed my role mechanically. I answered questions with textbook precision, gave nothing personal, and retreated to my quarters the moment protocol allowed. Callum never pushed. He never asked why I was distant, never tried to coax warmth from me, never looked at me with the pity I kept expecting and dreading. He simply showed up, did his job, and occasionally said things that caught me off guard. The garden has a bench near the south wall that gets the last light of the day, he told me once, for no apparent reason. If you ever want somewhere quiet, it is a good spot. I did not go to the bench, but I noticed it from my window, and I noticed that he sat there sometimes in the evenings, alone, reading from a small device. He did not look up at my window. He did not perform solitude for my benefit. He simply sat there, and for reasons I could not explain, the sight of someone choosing to be peacefully alone made me feel less violently lonely. During those early days, I began cataloging human behaviors the way a xenobiologist might catalog the habits of an unfamiliar species. It was easier to study them than to feel anything about my own situation. Humans, I discovered, were compulsive caretakers. A maintenance worker named George noticed I flinched at the overhead lighting in the hallways and, without being asked, adjusted the fixtures along my regular route to a softer setting. A kitchen staff member whose name I never learned spent an entire afternoon researching withHFY dietary profiles and left a plate of adapted food outside my door with a handwritten note that said simply, "Tried something new. Hope this is closer." The food was not close at all, but I ate every bite because the note made my throat tighten in a way I could not explain. They touched each other constantly. Hands on shoulders, brief embraces, fingers interlocking while walking. In withHFY society, physical contact outside bonded pairs was regulated by strict protocols of rank and relationship. Here, two colleagues who had not seen each other since the previous afternoon would clasp hands and ask about each other's families, as if a single night apart had been a meaningful separation. They seemed to exist in a constant state of reconnection, as if every moment together required acknowledgement because they understood, on some deep and possibly unconscious level, that their short lives made every meeting potentially the last. I found it exhausting to watch. I also found that I could not stop watching. The medical intake happened on my fourth day. Callum explained it gently, as a routine health screening, standard for all non-human visitors, designed to ensure the environment was not causing me harm. A human physician named Dr. Hargreaves conducted the examination with polite professionalism, scanning me with instruments that were clunky and unsophisticated compared to withHFY medical technology, but thorough in their own blunt way. I expected the examination to be unremarkable. It was, until Dr. Hargreaves paused over a particular set of readings and asked Callum to step in. "There are some hormonal markers here I would like to discuss with the princess," she said, carefully. "Certain levels that seem atypical compared to the baseline withHFY physiology data we have on file." Callum looked at me with a question in his eyes that was not invasive, but genuinely concerned. "Is that all right with you?" I could have refused. I could have told them it was a private matter. A withHFY concern, none of their business. And part of me wanted to, because the wall I had built around this particular truth was the oldest and strongest wall I had, and every brick of it was made of shame. But something about the way they asked, both of them, without assumption, without the heavy, loaded gravity that withHFY physicians always carried when they looked at me, made me open my mouth and say it plainly. "I am Dakel. The word does not translate precisely, but it means that my reproductive system is non-functional. It has never activated. I am Barren." I said it the way I had learned to say it over decades of practice. Flat, clinical. A fact about a body I had long since stopped thinking of as fully mine. Your doctors cannot help. No one can. Dr. Hargreaves wrote something down. Callum did not flinch. He did not look away. He did not offer the careful, constructed sympathy that withHFY diplomats used when they wanted to acknowledge a deficiency without appearing rude. He simply nodded and said something that I was not prepared for. "Would you mind if I had a colleague look at your results? Not to fix anything, just to understand. We have never had the chance to study withHFY biology before, and understanding your baseline could help us be better hosts." It was such a human way to frame it. Not, we want to examine your defect. Not, we can cure you. Just, we want to understand, so we can help. I agreed, expecting nothing, because expecting nothing was the only defense I had left, and it had never once failed me. That evening, Dorath found me standing in the garden near the south wall bench. I had not planned to go there. My feet had simply carried me while my mind was elsewhere. You told them, Dorath said. It was not a question. They asked. And? And nothing. They are humans, Dorath. What could they possibly do that 11,000 years of withHFY medicine has not? She stood beside me in the fading light and said nothing for a while. The garden smelled of something sweet and green that I could not name. Somewhere in the compound, someone was playing music. It drifted through the warm air like smoke, a slow melody carried by a single stringed instrument, and it was so beautiful and so sad that I had to close my eyes against it. My communicator chimed. A message from withHFY, routed through official diplomatic channels. I opened it. Dear sister, it read. I trust your mission among the humans proceeds well. The court sends its warmest regards and hopes that your time among our newest galactic neighbors proves enriching. Father asks after your health, though his schedule has not permitted a personal message. We think of you often. Every word was a needle. Mission, instead of exile. Warmest regards, from a court that had laughed. Father asks when father would not look at me. We think of you, when they had already forgotten me. The last line was the worst. I pray that the simplicity of human life agrees with your constitution. Sometimes a quieter existence is its own kind of blessing. I deleted the message. Dorath watched me do it and said nothing. Then she put her hand on my shoulder, the first physical contact anyone had offered me in weeks, and it took every piece of discipline I had not to shatter right there in that alien garden under that alien sky. They did not send me here to serve, I said, and my voice was steady even though nothing else inside me was. They sent me here to disappear. Dorath's hand tightened on my shoulder. Then we will make sure, she said quietly, that you do not. Callum's colleague arrived 6 days later, and she was nothing like what I expected. Her name was Dr. Lucy Ashworth, and she was a reproductive endocrinologist who had spent the last decade working on xenobiology fertility research at a university I could not pronounce. She was small even by human standards, with sharp gray eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a severe knot, and she moved through the medical wing like she owned it. She shook my hand with a grip that surprised me, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, I have been reading your scans for 3 days, and I have a question that might sound rude, so I am going to ask it anyway. I blinked. Proceed. Has anyone in your entire medical history ever actually investigated why your reproductive system does not activate? Or did they scan you, confirm the organs were dormant, label you docile, and close the file? I opened my mouth to answer and then stopped. Because the answer, when I actually examined it, was devastating in its simplicity. I had been examined dozens of times throughout my life. Scanned, measured, assessed. Every withHFY physician who had ever looked at my results had done exactly the same thing. They had confirmed the dormancy, recorded it, and moved on. Not one of them had asked why. Not one had treated the dormancy as a mystery to be solved. They had treated it as a verdict to be accepted. They confirmed and closed the file, I said. Lucy Ashworth made a sound that I would later learn was the human expression of professional disgust. Right, she said. Well, I did not fly 6,000 kilometers to confirm and close a file. Let us actually look at what is happening inside you. The examinations she conducted over the following week were unlike anything I had experienced in withHFY medical facilities. withHFY medicine was elegant, top-down, and categorical. A condition was identified, classified, and managed according to established protocols. The system was ancient, refined, and efficient. It was also, I was beginning to realize, fundamentally incurious. It cataloged what existed. It did not ask what could exist instead. Human medicine, as practiced by Lucy Ashworth, was something else entirely. It was messy, invasive, relentless, and driven by a single philosophy that I could not have articulated at the time, but that I now understand perfectly. Human medicine refuses to accept that anything simply is what it is. It pokes, it prods, It hypothesizes, tests, fails, adjusts, and tries again. It treats the body not as a fixed system to be categorized, but as a puzzle to be understood, and it approaches that puzzle with a stubbornness that borders on obsession. Lucy ran scans that no Karethi physician would have thought to run, because the questions she was asking were questions no Karethi physician would have thought to ask. She mapped my hormonal pathways at a resolution that made our medical equipment look crude. She cross-referenced my endocrine readings against the baseline data that Callum's team had been compiling on Karethi biology. She consulted with 3 other human specialists via video communication, talking rapidly in technical language that even the translation system struggled with, waving her hands in the air, as if she could physically reshape the problem by gesturing at it hard enough. On the 8th day, she called me into the medical wing and closed the door. "I found it," she said. There was no ceremony in her voice, no dramatic build-up. She was a scientist, delivering a finding, and the finding was apparently so significant that she could not waste time on presentation. "Your reproductive system is not dead, Viara. It is suppressed." I sat very still. "Explain." She pulled up a holographic display of my endocrine system, something Callum's team had built using a combination of their scanning technology and our biological data. She pointed to a cluster of glands near my lower torso that I recognized as the Karethi reproductive regulatory complex. "In a typical Karethi female," she said, "these glands produce a dormancy signal during childhood that keeps the reproductive system inactive until puberty. During puberty, a cascade of hormonal changes overrides that signal, and the system activates. It is elegant, effective, and almost universal." She looked at me. "In you, the override never triggered. The dormancy signal has been running continuously since you were born. Your reproductive organs are fully formed, structurally intact, and theoretically functional. They have simply never been told to turn on." The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system humming. I could hear my own heartbeat, which had become very fast and very loud. "You are telling me," I said carefully, "that there is nothing wrong with my body. I am telling you that your body has a switch that never flipped. That is not a spiritual verdict. That is not an irreversible condition. That is a chemical signal that can potentially be overridden." I gripped the edges of the examination table. My vision narrowed, and for a moment, I thought I might fall. Because if what she was saying was true, then everything I had been told about myself, everything I had believed, everything that had been used to diminish and discard and exile me, was based on a lie. Not a deliberate lie. Something worse. Ignorance. The laziest, most destructive kind of ignorance, the kind that looks at a problem, decides it is unsolvable, and walks away without ever actually trying to solve it. "Why?" I said, and my voice cracked for the first time in years. "Why did no one find this before?" Lucy sat down across from me. Her expression was not pitying, it was angry on my behalf, and that was somehow worse and better at the same time. "Because no one looked," she said. "Your medical tradition identified the condition, categorized it, and filed it away. That is not a failure of technology. Your technology is more advanced than ours in many ways. It is a failure of philosophy. Your doctors saw a dormant system and concluded it was meant to be dormant. My doctors see a dormant system and ask, what would happen if we woke it up?" She explained the potential treatment. A targeted hormonal therapy, adapted from human fertility protocols, designed to mimic the puberty cascade that should have triggered naturally. It had never been attempted on a Karethi. The biochemistry would need to be adjusted, the dosages calculated from scratch, the interactions monitored in real time. It could work. It could fail. It could cause complications she could not predict. "I will not lie to you about the risks," she said. "This is experimental. You would be the first. And I cannot promise it will work." I sat in that medical room for a long time after she left. Dorath came and sat with me, and I told her everything, and she wept. Not with sadness, with fury. The same fury I could feel building inside me, a pressure behind my ribs that had been growing for decades and was now threatening to crack me open from the inside. Callum came in the evening. He did not ask what I had decided, because I had not decided yet, and he seemed to understand that the decision was not simple. He sat in the chair beside me and said, You do not have to do this for them, Vyara. For whom? For the court. For your sister. For anyone who made you feel like you needed to prove something. You do not owe anyone proof that you are enough. He paused. But if you want to know what is possible for your own body, because it is your body, and your life, and your right to understand it, then Lucy and I will help you. No conditions, no expectations. I looked at him, this plain, soft-skinned creature from a death world, this man who had no crest, no bioluminescence, no venom glands, nothing that the Kirethi would consider marks of worth or power. And yet he had just said the most important words anyone had ever said to me, and he had said them as if they were obvious, as if the idea that my body belonged to me and my choices were my own was so self-evident that it did not even require emphasis. I decided to try. The treatment began 3 days later and lasted 9 weeks. Lucy had warned me it would be difficult, and she had not exaggerated. The hormonal adjustments sent my body into a state of upheaval it had never known. Systems that had been dormant for my entire life began stirring, waking, demanding attention, and the process was neither gentle nor graceful. I experienced temperature fluctuations, appetite changes, emotional volatility that frightened me, and physical pain in parts of my body that had never produced sensation before. There were days when I could not leave my quarters, days when the world felt too bright, too loud, too much. Dorath stayed close, managing my medications, monitoring my vitals, and occasionally arguing with Lucy about dosages with a fierce protectiveness that I found both annoying and deeply touching. Callum checked on me every day. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we did not. On the worst days, he simply sat in the common area while I lay in my sleeping compartment with the door open, and his presence on the other side of that doorway was an anchor I did not know I needed. He told me about his life during those quiet hours, how he had lost his mother when he was young, how the loss had shaped him, pushed him toward xenobiology, toward the study of lives different from his own. I wanted to understand people I would never get to meet, he said one evening. People from other worlds, other histories. I thought if I could understand them, maybe the universe would feel less empty. Does it? I asked. Feel less empty? He looked at me and smiled. It did the day you landed. There was one particularly bad night in the 4th week, when my temperature spiked so high that Dorath sent an emergency alert to the medical wing. Lucy came running at 3 in the morning, her hair uncombed, her lab coat thrown over sleeping clothes. She adjusted my medication, sat with me until the fever broke, and then stayed an extra hour just to be certain. When I apologized for waking her, she looked at me as if I had said something offensive. "You are my patient," she said. "You do not apologize for needing help. That is what help is for." It was such a simple thing to say, such a human thing, and yet no Kirethi physician had ever said anything like it to me. In Kirethi medical culture, a patient was a case to be managed, a data set to be processed. You did not apologize for being a case, but neither did anyone reassure you that your case mattered to them personally. The concept of medical care as a form of personal investment was alien to me in the most literal sense. Callum brought me human literature during the recovery periods. Stories, he called them. Fiction. Invented accounts of people who never existed, doing things that never happened, in places that were not real. I found the concept baffling at first. The Kirethi produced historical records, scientific documentation, and philosophical treatises. The idea of spending time creating elaborate accounts of imaginary lives seemed like a spectacular waste of cognitive resources. But the stories he chose were carefully selected, and as I read them, I began to understand what they were for. They were practice. Practice for empathy, for understanding, for imagining yourself inside the skin of another being and feeling what they felt. Humans did not just study other lives. They invented them, inhabited them, lived them from the inside out. It was, I realized, the same impulse that drove their medicine. The relentless, almost compulsive need to look inside something and understand how it worked. I told him things I had never told anyone, not the clinical facts of my condition, but the lived reality of it. The way it felt to sit in a room full of bonded Kirethi couples and know that no one would ever look at you the way they looked at each other. The specific, surgical cruelty of being excluded from the bonding rites. which were not just reproductive ceremonies but the central social ritual of our culture, the event around which all belonging was organized. The way my father's refusal to look at me was worse than any insult, because it meant I had become something he could not bring himself to see. Callum listened to all of it. He did not try to fix it with words. He did not compare my pain to his, or anyone else's. He simply received it, and in the receiving, he made it lighter. The weeks passed. The treatment progressed. Lucy adjusted, recalibrated, adapted. She and her team worked with a tireless precision that I had begun to recognize as distinctly human. They did not accept setbacks. They did not categorize complications as evidence that the process was doomed. Every problem was a puzzle, and every puzzle had a solution. And they would find it, or they would invent one. On the 63rd day, Lucy called me into the medical wing for the final round of comprehensive scans. She was calm, but I knew her well enough by now to see the tension in her jaw, the way she held her hands too still. Dorath stood by the door, her silk a pale, anxious green. Gillam waited outside, because I had asked him to, because whatever happened in this room, I needed to face it standing on my own feet first. The scans took 40 minutes. Lucy reviewed the results in silence, her eyes moving across data streams I could not read. Then she looked up at me, and her expression shifted into something I had never seen on her face before. "It worked," she said. "Full activation. Hormonal cascade is self-sustaining. You are no longer dormant." I heard the words. I understood them, but they did not land immediately. They hovered in front of me like something fragile, something that might break if I reached for it too quickly. I looked at the scan of my own body, at the systems glowing with activity, where there had been darkness for my entire life, and I felt the floor tilt beneath me. I was not Dale. I had never been Dale. I had been a woman, with a switch that no one bothered to flip, in a civilization that decided the switch was a judgment rather than a malfunction. And I had carried that false verdict like a stone around my neck for decades, letting it shape every thought I had about myself, every relationship I failed to build, every dream I refused to dream, because I had been taught that I was not built for dreaming. I sat down on the examination table and pressed both hands flat against its surface. The room was very still. Lucy watched me with the controlled patience of someone who understood that what was happening inside me right now was bigger than medicine. I breathed. I kept breathing, and somewhere between one breath and the next, I felt something open inside my chest that I had no name for. It took me hours to identify it. It was possibility. Raw, terrifying, limitless possibility. And I had never felt it before in my life. 4 months after the treatment ended, I woke up in my quarters on Earth and knew that something had changed. It was not the nausea, though that was what drove me from the sleeping platform to the bathing facility before the sun had risen. It was not the strange heaviness in my lower body, or the way my skin flushed hot and cold in alternating waves. It was something deeper, something cellular, a shift in the fundamental frequency of my own biology, that I could feel humming beneath my conscious awareness like a second heartbeat. Dorath heard me and came to the door. She took one look at my face, and her silk shifted to a color I had never seen it produce before. A deep, luminous gold that in Kirethi culture signified only one thing. "Viara," she whispered. "Do not say it," I said. "Not until we know." We went to the medical wing before the compound was awake. Lucy was already there, because Lucy was always there, working on research or reviewing data or arguing with colleagues on the other side of the planet via video link. She looked up when we entered, saw our faces, and stood immediately. "Sit down," she said, and her voice carried a steadiness that I needed to borrow because I had none of my own. She ran the scans. I lay on the table and stared at the ceiling, and counted the tiles because, if I thought about what might be happening inside me, I would shatter into pieces too small to reassemble. The scan took 12 minutes. 12 minutes that contained more hope and more terror than the previous 3 decades of my life combined. When it was done, Lucy looked at the results. She looked at them for a long time. Then she turned the display toward me and said, "Viara, you are pregnant." The sound that came out of Dorath was not a word. It was a keening, musical note that Kirethi women produce only in moments of overwhelming joy, a sound rooted so deeply in our biology that it cannot be faked or suppressed. She pressed both hands to her face and wept openly, her silk blazing gold, and she did not try to compose herself because some moments are too important for composure. I could not weep. I could not speak. I lay on that table in a human medical facility on a planet that should have been my exile, and I looked at the scan of my own body, and there, nestled within me, was a tiny cluster of cells that had no right to exist. A Kirethi human hybrid. Something no geneticist in the galaxy had predicted was possible. Something that should not have been, but was. I was carrying a child. The Barren princess. The discarded daughter. The woman sent to the edge of space as a punchline. I was going to be a mother. Lucy explained the science in careful, measured terms. The genetic compatibility between Kirethi and human biology was improbable but real, a consequence of convergent evolutionary architecture that no one had thought to test because no one had ever considered the pairing worth studying. Our species shared enough baseline biological framework, enough fundamental chemistry, that the combination was not merely possible, but viable. The child would be something new. Not Kirethi, not human, but a bridge between two worlds that had never known they could be connected. I sat with that knowledge in the medical wing for nearly an hour after Lucy left to make arrangements. Dorath sat beside me, her hand on my arm, her silk still blazing gold, and she hummed a melody that I recognized from childhood. It was a song our mothers sang to daughters on the day of their first quickening, the moment when fertility was confirmed. She had never had reason to sing it to me before. The melody was old and simple, and it broke me wide open. I wept. For the first time since leaving Kirethi Prime, I wept. Not from sadness. From the sheer, overwhelming weight of a future I had never allowed myself to imagine, arriving all at once, like dawn breaking over a horizon I had been told did not exist. I found Callum in the garden. He was sitting on the south wall bench, reading, the way he did most mornings. He looked up when he heard me approaching, and something in my walk or my face must have told him that this was not a routine visit, because he set his device aside and stood. "What happened?" he asked. I stood in front of him in the morning light of an alien sun, on a planet whose gravity still pulled at my knees, and whose air still smelled like nothing I had known before arriving here, and I told him. I said the words out loud, and they tasted like something I wanted to keep saying for the rest of my life. I am pregnant. The child is yours. Callum went very still. The kind of still that humans produce when their minds are processing something too large for immediate response. His eyes searched my face, and I watched him move through shock, confusion, wonder, and something fierce and tender that I did not have a Kirethi word for, because we did not have a Kirethi concept for it. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Lucy confirmed it 20 minutes ago." He reached for my hand, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. I did not pull away. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid, and he said, "Tell me what you need. Not what does this mean for galactic relations. Not, is this politically advantageous. Not, what will your people think." He asked me what I needed, and in that question, in its simplicity and its focus, I understood something about this man, and about his species, that I had been slowly learning for months, but had not yet put into words. Humans do not begin with the system. They begin with the person. Always the person first. Everything else is secondary. The pregnancy was medically complex from the start. Lucy assembled a team of 4 additional specialists, and they established a dedicated monitoring protocol that tracked every variable they could measure, and several they invented measurements for. A Kirethi human hybrid had never existed before. There were no textbooks, no case studies, no precedents. Every day brought new data and new questions. My body struggled with certain aspects. The hybrid biology created conflicting demands on my nutritional needs, my hormonal balance, and my immune response. There were days when I could not keep food down, and days when I could not stay awake. There was a terrifying week in the 3rd month, when my body tried to reject the pregnancy, and Lucy and her team worked around the clock, adjusting medications, monitoring fetal development, fighting for every hour. Through all of it, the humans treated every complication the same way they treated everything, as a problem to be solved. Not a sign that this was wrong, not evidence that the pregnancy was unnatural, not a reason to give up, just a puzzle. Just another puzzle, and they would find the answer, or build one from scratch. I learned, during those months, that human medicine operates on a principle that the Karethi would find philosophically offensive. They call it trial and error. They try something. If it fails, they study the failure, adjust their approach, and try again. They do not view failure as evidence of fundamental wrongness. They view it as data. Every failure narrows the field of possibility, and every narrowing brings them closer to the answer. It is inefficient. It is messy. It is also, I have come to believe, the most powerful approach to problem solving in the galaxy, because it refuses to accept any outcome as final. Lucy lost weight during those months. I noticed it even when she tried to hide it. The way her clothing hung differently, the shadows under her eyes deepening week by week. She was pouring herself into this pregnancy with a dedication that went beyond professional obligation. One evening, when I asked her why, she sat down across from me and was quiet for a long time. Because when I was 23, I was told I could not have children, she said, and I spent 5 years finding a way to prove that diagnosis wrong. Nobody helped me, nobody cared enough to look. She met my eyes. I will not let that happen to anyone else if I can prevent it. I reached across the space between us and took her hand, and she let me, and neither of us spoke about it again. But from that moment forward, I understood that the humans helping me were not doing so out of scientific curiosity alone. They were doing it because they had each, in their own way, learned what it meant to be dismissed, and they had each decided that dismissal was not a verdict they would accept for themselves or for anyone else. Callum was beside me through every difficult day. He learned Karethi nutritional requirements so he could help Dorath prepare meals. He read every piece of xenobiology literature he could find on hybrid gestations in other species, looking for parallels, looking for warnings, looking for anything that might help Lucy's team anticipate the next challenge. He held my hand during the painful procedures and told me terrible jokes that were not funny in any language but made me laugh anyway because the effort behind them was so earnest. I realized I was in love with him on a Tuesday afternoon, while he was arguing with the nutrition synthesizer about the calcium content of a Karethi grain supplement. He was losing the argument. The machine kept producing a powder that was the wrong consistency, and he kept adjusting the settings with increasing frustration, muttering under his breath. It was such an ordinary moment, such a small, unremarkable fragment of a day, and I looked at him and felt something lock into place inside my chest, with an almost audible click, a certainty so complete that it did not feel like an emotion. It felt like a fact, like gravity, like the rotation of a planet around its star. The news reached the Karethi sovereignty in my 5th month. It was Dorath's doing, though not intentional. She had been communicating with her sister on Karethi Prime through personal channels, sharing her joy in the careful, coded way that Karethi women discuss reproductive matters. But the codes were not as secure as she believed, and the message was intercepted by court intelligence monitors who were, apparently, still watching communications from my shuttle. The reaction was immediate and seismic. I received an official communication from the Office of the Crown Heir within 2 days. Sevethi's voice, transmitted across light years, was perfectly controlled and perfectly furious. Sister, reports have reached the sovereignty that you have undergone unauthorized medical procedures and are carrying a hybrid offspring. The court requires your immediate return for assessment of your condition and evaluation of the genetic viability of the pregnancy. A diplomatic vessel has been dispatched. You will prepare for transfer upon its arrival. I listened to the message twice. Then I sat in my quarters and composed a reply. I did not consult Callum. I did not ask Dorath. I did not request permission from anyone, because this was my body and my child and my life, and I was done asking permission. I will return when I choose, I said into the recording device, and my child is not yours to assess. I sent it, and felt something break free inside me that had been chained down for decades. It was the part of me that had always known my exile was unjust, that my silence was not acceptance but survival, and that survival was no longer enough. Callum found me in the common area afterward. He had received a parallel communication through diplomatic channels, a formal notice from the Kirathi sovereignty, requesting the return of their citizen for medical review. He looked at me with those dark, steady eyes, and I saw something in them that I had seen in glimpses before but never at full strength. Resolve. The particular human kind of resolve that does not announce itself with displays of force but simply plants its feet and refuses to move. I have contacted the Xeno-Diplomatic Corps, he said. I have informed them that a foreign government is attempting to exert coercive control over a resident of Earth and her unborn child. Earth has laws about this, Viara, strong ones, and they apply to everyone within our borders, regardless of species. I stared at him. You would put yourself between the Kirathi sovereignty and their princess? I would put myself between anyone and a woman who is being told she does not own her own body. He sat beside me. You are not alone in this. You have not been alone in this for a long time. The diplomatic machinery activated with a speed that startled me. Within 48 hours, the UN Xeno-Diplomatic Corps had formally acknowledged my residency rights, assigned a legal advocate to my case, and transmitted a politely worded but unmistakably firm response to the Kirathi sovereignty, stating that Princess Viara was a voluntary resident of Earth, that her medical decisions were protected under terrestrial human rights law, and that any attempt to compel her return would be considered a diplomatic incident. The Kirathi did not back down. Sevathi herself boarded the diplomatic vessel that had been dispatched, bringing with her a retinue of court physicians, political advisors, and 2 members of the royal guard. The vessel was not a warship, but it was not a passenger craft either. It was a statement, wrapped in the thin skin of diplomacy. I had 3 weeks before it arrived. 3 weeks to prepare for a confrontation I had spent my entire life avoiding. 3 weeks during which my body continued to grow and change, and produce a child who kicked against my ribs with a strength that was definitely more human than Kirathi. On the night before the Kirathi vessel entered Earth's solar system, I went into labor. It was too early, 3 weeks too early. Lucy had warned me that the hybrid biology made the timeline unpredictable, but the warning had been academic, until the first contraction hit me like a fist, and I dropped to my knees in the common area, with a sound I did not recognize as my own voice. Dorath was beside me in seconds. Callum was beside me in minutes. Lucy was beside me before I had finished counting the interval between the first and second contractions, already giving orders to her team, already converting the medical wing into a delivery suite. This is early, she said, and her voice was calm in the way that human doctors become calm when the situation is serious enough to require absolute control. But we are ready. We have been ready for this since the day you told us. They moved me to the medical wing. The lights were bright. The equipment hummed. Dorath held one of my hands, and Callum held the other, and I gripped them both hard enough to bruise because the pain was enormous and relentless and unlike anything I had been prepared for. Somewhere above us, the Kirathi diplomatic vessel dropped out of compressed space at the edge of Earth's system. Sevathi was coming for me, coming for my child, coming to reassert control over the piece of her family's legacy that had dared to become something other than a footnote. I felt another contraction tear through me, and I pulled Callum's hand to my face and pressed it against my cheek, and I said the only words that mattered. Do not let them take her. It was the first time I had spoken about the baby with a pronoun. I had been careful, superstitious, afraid that naming the child's presence too specifically would tempt the universe to take it away. But I could feel her now, fighting her way into existence with a determination that was unmistakably, ferociously human, and I knew her. I already knew her. I already loved her with a completeness that terrified me. Callum pressed his forehead against mine. No one is taking her, he said. No one is taking either of you, I promise. The labor lasted 14 hours. Lucy told me afterward that there were moments when she was not sure we would both survive it. The hybrid biology created complications that no medical literature had ever documented, because no Kirathi human child had ever been born before, and every assumption they made about how the delivery would proceed had to be abandoned and rebuilt in real time. My body did not know how to do what it was doing. It was performing a function it had never evolved to perform, carrying a child whose genetic architecture was a conversation between two species that had never spoken to each other on a cellular level. and that conversation was not always harmonious. There were hours of pain so intense that my vision went white, and I lost the ability to form words in any language. There were moments when the monitors alarmed, and Lucy's team moved with a controlled urgency that I knew, even through the haze of agony, meant something was going wrong. There were minutes when everything went quiet, and the only sounds were my own ragged breathing, and the beep of machines measuring my child's heartbeat. And those quiet minutes were the most terrifying of all, because silence in a medical room is never good. Dalam did not leave. He stayed at my side through every contraction, every complication, every moment when the outcome was uncertain. He was not medically useful. He could not read the monitors, or adjust the medications, or make decisions about surgical interventions. But I had asked him to stay, and he stayed, and his hand in mine was the fixed point around which the entire universe rotated during those 14 hours. Dorath stood by the door like a sentinel. She had wanted to be closer, but the medical team needed space, and Dorath, for all her fierce loyalty, understood that the humans in this room were fighting for my life, and my child's life, with every tool they had, and the best thing she could do was stay out of their way and let them fight. Lucy was extraordinary. I say this not with the biased gratitude of a patient, but with the objective assessment of someone who watched a scientist face an impossible problem and refused to accept impossibility as an answer. Every time the hybrid biology threw something unexpected at her, she adapted. Every time a protocol failed, she invented a new one. She communicated with her team in clipped, precise language, making decisions in seconds that would have taken a Kirethi medical board hours of deliberation, and she made them correctly, every single time. In the 13th hour, something went wrong that was not like the other things that had gone wrong. The monitors produced a sound I had not heard before, a long, continuous tone that made every human in the room stop moving for a fraction of a second, before they moved faster than they had moved all night. Lucy said something sharp to her team, and hands were on me, and instruments were pressed against my abdomen, and I felt a pressure that was different from the contractions, deeper, more structural, as if something inside me was shifting in a direction it was not supposed to go. I looked at Callum. His face was white. He was squeezing my hand so tightly that I could feel the bones in his fingers shifting against each other, and his eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that was beyond fear. It was the look of a man who was watching the two most important things in his universe, balanced on the edge of a blade, and could do absolutely nothing but stand there and hope. "Stay with me," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. I wanted to tell him that I was not going anywhere. I wanted to tell him that I had not survived 30 years of exile in my own court, a journey across the galaxy, 9 weeks of experimental treatment, and 5 months of the most complicated pregnancy in recorded history, just to leave now. But I could not speak because the pain had taken my words, so I squeezed his hand back, and I hoped he understood. Lucy worked. Her team worked, and 14 hours and 23 minutes after the first contraction dropped me to my knees, my daughter was born. She came into the world screaming. Not the thin, reedy cry of a Kirethi newborn, which is more of a musical hum than a true vocalization. This was a full-throated, lung-powered, absolutely furious scream that rattled the medical equipment and made Dorath press both hands over her ears. She was screaming with human lungs and Kirethi vocal resonance, and the combination produced a sound so loud and so alive that it filled the room like a physical force. Lucy lifted her and placed her on my chest, and the scream softened into a series of hiccuping gasps, and then into silence as she found the warmth of my body and settled against it. I looked down at her and saw everything. She had my skin, silver lilac, but with undertones of warm brown that were her father's contribution to her impossible existence. My cranial ridges were there, but softened, gentled into smooth curves that swept back from her forehead, like the memory of a crest rather than the thing itself. And her eyes, when she opened them, were dark. Not the pale violet of Kirethi eyes, but the deep, rich brown of her father's. And they looked up at me, with the unfocused intensity of a creature that had just arrived in the universe and was already trying to understand it. She was beautiful. She was impossible. She was mine. Callum leaned over us both, and I watched him see his daughter for the first time. His hand trembled as he touched her cheek with one finger, tracing the line of her softened ridge, feeling the warmth of skin that was neither fully Kirethi nor fully human, but something entirely new. A tear fell from his eye onto her forehead, and she flinched at the moisture and made a small sound of protest that was so perfectly ordinary, so utterly mundane, that it broke something open inside both of us. "She is real," he whispered. "She is real," I said. Dorath came to us, and looked at the child, and made the keening sound again, the note of joy, and this time, I made it with her. 2 Kirethi women, and a human man, and a child who belonged to all of them, and to no category that the galaxy had ever created, singing together in a medical room, on a planet that spun through space making noise, always making noise, because it had never learned to be silent, and never would. 7 hours later, Sevathi arrived. She came with her retinue of 6, stepping off the shuttle with the practiced grace of a crown heir, who had never once doubted her right to occupy any space she entered. Her silk burned sovereign crimson, and her crest was fully extended, and she walked across the compound grounds as if she were crossing her own throne room. She was met at the entrance to the medical wing by Callum, who had showered and changed, but had not slept, and by a 4-person team from the UN Xeno-Diplomatic Corps, who wore dark suits and polite expressions, and carried legal tablets loaded with terrestrial human rights statutes. "Crown Heir Sevathi," Callum said. "Welcome to Earth. You are here as a diplomatic visitor and are afforded all courtesies of that status. However, I must inform you that you have no jurisdictional authority within this facility or within the borders of this planet. Princess Viara is a voluntary resident of Earth and is protected under terrestrial law." Sevathi looked at him, the way a predator looks at something it has not yet decided whether to eat. "I am here to see my sister. Your sister has just given birth. She will see you when she is ready." I made them wait 2 hours, not out of spite, though I will admit the thought crossed my mind. I made them wait because I needed those 2 hours. I needed to hold my daughter and feed her, and learn the weight of her in my arms. I needed to memorize the pattern of her breathing, the way her tiny fingers curled around mine, with a grip that was far stronger than anything her size should have been capable of. I needed to count her toes, which numbered 10 like her father's rather than 8 like mine, and touch each of the soft ridges on her scalp, which would harden into proper crests as she grew, and watch the way light played across skin that was neither fully silver nor fully brown, but something luminous and new. I needed to sit in that bed and feel the reality of what had happened settle into my bones. I needed to be, for 2 uninterrupted hours, a mother, just a mother, before I became a princess again. Dorath sat by the window during those hours, watching the corridor, her body angled so that she could see anyone approaching before they reached the door. She had positioned herself as a guard without being asked, and I loved her for it with a fierceness that I hoped she could feel without my having to say it. Callum brought me water and sat beside us, watching our daughter sleep. He had changed his clothes, but his eyes were red-rimmed and tired, and there was a bruise on the back of his hand where I had gripped him during the worst hours. I touched the bruise gently. "I am sorry," I said. "Do not apologize," he said. "That bruise is the best thing that has ever happened to my hand." I almost laughed. I was too exhausted to laugh, but something moved inside my chest that was shaped like laughter, and he saw it, and that was enough. When I was ready, I told Callum to bring her in. Sevathi entered the room alone, as I had requested. Her retinue waited outside, watched by the diplomatic team with unfailing politeness. She stopped 3 steps inside the door. I was sitting upright in the medical bed, my daughter in my arms. Callum stood at my left. Lucy stood at my right. Dorath stood by the window, her silk steady gray, her eyes fixed on Sevathi, with an expression that I recognized as the look of a woman who would happily commit violence if given sufficient provocation. Sevathi looked at the child. Her silk flickered through several colors in rapid succession before settling on a controlled neutral. Her face revealed nothing. She had been trained by the same court I had, and she was better at the performance than I had ever been. "Sister," she said, "you look well. I am well. Better than I have ever been. The child is healthy. Perfectly. It is hybrid." "She is hybrid. She is also your niece." Sevathi's jaw tightened by a fraction. The sovereignty has concerns about the genetic implications of this pregnancy. The court's physicians have been authorized to conduct a full assessment of both you and the child, and to make recommendations regarding your return to withHFY Prime. I let the silence stretch. I let it fill the room. I let withHFY stand in it and feel its weight, because silence was a weapon I had learned from watching her use it for decades, and I had finally found an occasion worthy of its deployment. No, I said. One word, 2 letters, the most powerful sound I had ever produced. withHFY's composure cracked by a millimeter. This is not a request, Viara. The sovereignty has legal claim to all members of the royal bloodline. The child carries that blood. The child carries my blood, and the blood of her father, and she was conceived and born on this planet, and she is protected by the laws of this world. Your legal claims end at the edge of Earth's atmosphere. You cannot keep a withHFY princess from her own people. I am not keeping her from anyone. I am protecting her from people who would assess her like livestock. I looked at my sister, and I saw her clearly, perhaps for the first time. Not the towering figure of my childhood fears, not the architect of my exile, but a woman whose power depended entirely on a system of categorization that my daughter's existence had just rendered obsolete. withHFY, listen to me carefully, because I will say this once. She listened. She had no choice. The humans in the room were not threatening her, were not raising their voices, were not displaying any of the aggressive behaviors that the withHFY associated with confrontation. They were simply standing there, steady and immovable, and their presence communicated something that no amount of extended crests and crimson silk could override. This was their ground, and they were not moving. I was never broken, I said. My reproductive system was suppressed by a hormonal malfunction that could have been corrected at any point in my life. A simple treatment, a chemical switch that needed to be flipped. Any competent physician who bothered to investigate would have found it. I watched the words land. I watched withHFY process them. But no one investigated, I continued, because our civilization decided that dial was a verdict, not a diagnosis. Because our doctors cataloged the condition and closed the file. Because it was easier to label me defective than to ask whether the label was wrong. I was not a medical mystery, withHFY. I was a medical oversight, and the only reason it was corrected is that I ended up on a planet full of people who refuse to accept that anything is simply the way it is. withHFY said nothing. Her silk had gone pale, the color of shock she could not suppress. Humans did not fix me because they are smarter than us, I said. They fixed me because they looked. They looked at me, and they saw a person with a problem, and they decided the problem was worth solving. That is the difference. That is the only difference that has ever mattered. The room was very still. My daughter will know both her heritages, I said. She will learn the withHFY language, and the withHFY histories, and the songs our mother used to sing, but she will be raised here, on this world, among people who see her for what she is, not what she can provide. And if the sovereignty wants a relationship with her, it will be on terms that respect her as a person, not as a genetic asset. withHFY stood in that room for a long time without speaking. I could see the calculations running behind her eyes, the political equations, the cost-benefit analyses, the strategic implications. She was crown heir. She thought in systems. But I also saw something else. Something small and human-like that flickered across her features for just a moment before she locked it away. She looked at my daughter, sleeping peacefully in my arms, and her silk shifted to a color I had only seen once before in my life, when we were very young and she had not yet learned to control her displays. It was pale blue, the color of grief. "I will relay your position to the sovereign," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but there was something fragile underneath it. "The court will need time to consider the implications." "Take all the time you need," I said. "We will be here." The withHFY delegation departed the next morning. Their vessel lifted off the compound landing pad and rose through Earth's thick atmosphere and disappeared into the pale blue sky, carrying my sister and her retinue and their physicians and their legal claims back to a world that would never look quite the same to them again, because they had come expecting to find a broken princess and a political problem, And instead, they had found something far more dangerous. Proof that their oldest assumptions were wrong. I did not watch them leave. I was in the medical wing, sitting in a chair by the window, while Lucy conducted a follow-up examination on both me and Elia. My daughter lay on the examination table, surrounded by soft blankets, her dark eyes tracking the movement of Lucy's instruments, with a focus that Lucy declared was remarkable for a child her age. She was already watching, already studying, already trying to understand the world she had been born into, with the same stubborn curiosity that her father carried in every cell of his body. "She is perfect," Lucy said, and her voice carried the particular satisfaction of a scientist who had faced the impossible and made it bend. "Every metric is within viable ranges. The hybrid biology is stable and self-regulating." She looked at me. "You did something remarkable, Viara." "We did something remarkable," I corrected her. She smiled. It was the first time I had seen Lucy Ashworth smile without reservation, and it transformed her face from severe to luminous. Callum came in while Lucy was finishing her notes. He had been meeting with the UN diplomatic team, debriefing them on the confrontation, ensuring that the formal record accurately reflected what had happened. He looked tired but calm, the deep calm of a man who had weathered a storm and found the ground still solid beneath his feet. "The Xeno Diplomatic Corps is formally recognizing Elia as a dual heritage citizen," he said. "Earthborn, with protected status under the Convention on Interstellar Persons. No external government can claim jurisdiction over her without her own consent, and she cannot give that consent until she reaches the age of majority." I looked at my daughter, who was currently trying to fit her entire fist into her mouth. The age of majority seemed very far away. "They protect her," I said. "A child they have never met. A hybrid that their scientists said was impossible. They write laws to protect her." Callum sat beside me. "That is what we do," he said simply. "We find the vulnerable ones, and we build walls around them. Not to trap them, to keep them safe until they are strong enough to walk out on their own." I thought about the Kirethi court. About 11,000 years of recorded lineage, and not a single law that protected a child from being assessed like breeding stock. About a civilization so advanced that it could fold space and manipulate gravity and engineer entire ecosystems, but could not conceive of the idea that a person's worth might exist independent of their reproductive capacity. The humans had been among the stars for less than a generation, and they had already figured out something that the oldest empires in the galaxy had missed entirely. In the days that followed, I composed a message to my father, not through diplomatic channels, through the personal communication frequency that every Kirethi child learns from their parents, the one that bypasses protocol and rank and politics and speaks directly, heart to heart. "Father," I said, "I have a daughter, your granddaughter. Her name is Elia Mercer, and she has your mother's ridges and her father's eyes, and she screams loud enough to shake the walls when she is hungry. She is healthy and strong and impossible and real, and I want you to know her." I paused. I breathed. "I am not coming home. Not because I cannot, but because I have found a place where I am seen, and I will not leave it. If you want to see us, you know where we are. The door is open. It has always been open." That is something I learned from humans. They leave their doors open, even for people who have hurt them, even when it would be easier to lock them shut. I sent the message. I did not know if he would respond. I did not know if he would come. But the message was sent, and the door was open, and that was enough. On a warm evening 3 weeks after my daughter was born, I sat in the garden near the south wall bench. Elia slept against my chest, wrapped in a blanket that Dorath had woven from Kirethi silk and human cotton, two fabrics that should not have worked together but did. Callum sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched. The compound was quiet except for the constant background noise of Earth, birds in the trees, wind through the leaves, a radio playing somewhere in the distance, the hum of a planet that never stopped talking, never stopped singing, never stopped filling the silence with evidence of its own stubborn, chaotic, magnificent existence. I had hated that noise when I first arrived. It had felt like assault, like madness, like the sound of a species that had no discipline and no grace. But I understood it now. It was not noise. It was refusal. refusal to be quiet, refusal to accept the dark, refusal to stop reaching, searching, trying, even when the universe gave every indication that trying was pointless. They had sent me here as a punchline, the Barren princess, shipped off to the primitives. A joke wrapped in diplomatic language, designed to make me disappear so quietly that no one would notice I was gone. But the humans did not see a joke. They did not see a broken thing to be pitied, or a political inconvenience to be managed. They saw a person with a problem, and they decided, without hesitation, without conditions, without asking what they would get in return, that the problem was worth solving. That is the most dangerous thing about humanity. Not their weapons, though they have those. Not their ships, though they are building those. Not even their stubborn refusal to die on a planet that has been trying to kill them since the day they crawled out of the mud. The most dangerous thing about humanity is that they look at you. Really look. Not to categorize or assess or rank. Not to determine your value or your utility or your genetic contribution to the next generation. They look at you the way Callum looked at me that first day, standing on a landing pad under an alien sun. They look into you, and they find things that everyone else, including you, stopped searching for. I pressed my lips to the top of my daughter's head and breathed in the smell of her, which was like nothing and everything all at once. She stirred in her sleep and made a small sound, half human, half Kirethi, entirely her own. Callum's hand found mine in the fading light, and I held it, and the garden hummed with life around us. They sent me here to disappear. Instead, for the first time in my life, I was seen.